Good evening, everyone. It's November 14th, and after having an additional month away, it's good to be back with you all at our virtual town hall. And as always, I want to start by thanking our sponsors, especially the Lupus Foundation of America, Georgia chapter with Terry and the crew. Thanks for all that you do for us throughout the state. And I also represent the Georgia Council for Lupus Education and Awareness with Representative Kim Schofield and others on the council, as well as the Emory University Division of Rheumatology and the GOAL Project. And as always, please be reminded that none of what I'm presenting to you is intended to be direct medical advice that you should always check with your healthcare professional. So this is the map. Oh, by the way, I'm going to present some information that will be exciting and new. I hope it'll be up to date, the latest stuff from our annual scientific meeting at the American College of Rheumatology annual meeting. And so I'll have a section of that before we transition to questions at the end. So like we always do, we kind of get up to speed as to what COVID is doing throughout the world. And this is the heat map of the world as of 2 months ago. And you can get a sense of where all the activity was back then. And this is where it is now. And in many ways, it's not that much different. I guess the things that I would point out is the fact that there's less activity, thankfully, in Central America and much of South America compared to before, and in Africa and in most parts of China and Asia, except for Thailand. But we see a lot of activity remaining in the Middle East, going into Eastern Europe and through Western Europe, including Russia. And so that continues to be troublesome. So if you hadn't heard already, this is going to be the ebb and flow for a while as COVID becomes more endemic, meaning it's transitioning to something that we coexist with, but it'll be in a much palatable way, I think, in the future. But this is where we are now. And this is where the US was 2 months ago. You can see that the hot zones are all over the place, especially sort of centered around Tennessee and throughout the Southeast and the Northwest in particular. And this is the heat map now. And what's really striking here is the relative lack of activity in where we are in the Southeast, but a lot more so out west. And it really kind of started out in the northern states, and the thought was or is that with colder climates and people starting to go indoors more and being more directly in front of each other, that transmission is occurring easier, especially in the unvaccinated. So again, to kind of underscore everything what I've just said is, if you look at the blue bar for the South, where we are in Georgia, we certainly were the highest region for quite some time, especially with the Delta variant affecting the unvaccinated, which, our area has relatively larger numbers of unvaccinated compared to other parts of the country. And we have actually come down very nicely from the Delta variant surge, and we're one of the lower areas, but again, the ebb and flow, we're starting to see upticks in other parts of the country. And remember the several times we felt relatively safe in the past, and just to have it come back, we can't let our guard down. But for now, I mean, things are looking much better for sure in the South. So this is the US. In terms of new cases by day, here's the Delta peak, and it's come down, but you see kind of a sense that it's going up a bit here. Thankfully, the hospitalizations continue to go down. The good thing with the Delta variant too, actually, is that there was a lot more testing being done at that time. of the surge and more availability of that. So I think that is going to bode well for us in the future in terms of having another arsenal for us as we deal with new waves, and as well as new treatments and new immunizations and so forth. And the death counts are going down too, which is all good. Now, in our backyard in Georgia, this was 2 months ago, and this is where it is now. So much better. Still pockets throughout the state, especially in the middle and around the Columbus, Albany area. It always continues to sort of light up more relative to other parts of the states. But like the US, our case numbers are going down nicely. It does kind of seem that we're starting to plateau. So we always have to be on our guard. The testing went up a lot with the Delta variant, which is good. The hospitalizations are significantly down, and the deaths are tracking down. And you can see the percent changes for the past 2 weeks here in all favorable directions. Now I'm just going to go over some review. Full disclosure, I want to give credit to Dr. Jinus Yazdani, who gave this talk at our virtual annual conference of the American College of Rheumatology. She's a professor at University of California, San Francisco, and I've copied a lot of her slides actually. But she gave a nice presentation in terms of reviewing where we are in terms of the data that we have. Again, it's not so specific as much as we want in lupus. I have some more lupus specific data towards the end when we get into the questions. But just harkening back to where we were in the beginning, we knew that the older people were, more significant COVID infections would have on the outcomes, especially in terms of hospitalizations and death. And so, these are the total peaks of hospitalizations throughout the pandemic, and the different colors represent age groups, and the red bars are the proportion within each time period of people 65 and older. And then you can see 50 to 64 is in the blue, and just those two bars represent a very significant proportion at all time points of those that are hospitalized. But we also knew early on that people with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, chronic lung disease, cancer, chronic kidney disease, and obesity were at high risk of hospitalization and death. So what about people with lupus, but more broadly, people that are immunosuppressed, that are taking medications that lower their immune system because of their immune system issues? Are they at greater risk of getting the infection? And thankfully, the overall numbers have not shown to be significantly higher in people that are immunosuppressed as a very broad group. And this is just one of the earlier studies out of Italy, where they did a survey of patients in the Lombardy region in early 2020. They had a really good response, and they basically confirmed that the rate of COVID in that population of immunosuppressed patients was very similar to the general population in that area, with relatively few or no severe complications or deaths. And this is a study from South Korea that has a unified healthcare system. And so they examined over 130,000 patients throughout their healthcare system at this point of the study, and had a lot of testing for COVID, and found that 6.2% were of those that were in the study basically had an autoimmune inflammatory rheumatologic condition, including lupus, but several other conditions too. excuse me. And after matching, and what matching is if you want to know if a group with medical conditions are at higher risk than the general population, then you need to compare it with the general population, right? And matching ideally would be if you have a person with rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, you want a similar person in the general population with similar characteristics, except they don't have that condition. And so for every person that had an autoimmune inflammatory rheumatologic condition, they matched according to somebody in the general population with very similar age, same gender, and you do as much as practically possible within the data that you have. And you can go as far as people that match with someone that lives in the same area, and so forth. So they basically had a group that they pulled out of their database that was very similar to the group with rheumatologic conditions, except for the fact they didn't have rheumatologic conditions. And they compared the rate of COVID infections between those two groups, and it was very similar. It just showed a slightly increased risk of being COVID positive if you had an autoimmune condition, but it was not significantly higher. This is a study out of the VA, Veterans Administration Health System. In 2020, they looked at over 33,000 veterans with rheumatoid arthritis, and they compared with veterans that didn't have rheumatoid arthritis that were matched, or what we call controls. So very similar, except for they didn't have RA. And they found a slightly increased risk of COVID, about 27 cases per 1,000 individuals in those with rheumatoid arthritis versus 20.5 cases per 1,000 in the non-rheumatoid arthritis veterans. So, and by the way, we have information from our goal group, and we matched with the Georgia COVID registry, and we thankfully found very similar results, that the rates of COVID within people with lupus in goal were not significantly higher than the rest of the people in the state. And we were very concerned that there might be much higher rates, even despite some of the studies that I showed you, because being in Atlanta, we have people at very high risk, especially those who are from minority communities. And we're learning that people who are from communities of color, and especially those that have lower socioeconomic status, perhaps have jobs where they have to go and be very front-facing with the public and customers, and take public transportation. There's so much more opportunities to get infected without having the opportunity to perhaps stay at work, work from home as much as others. But thankfully, at least the last time we looked, the rates were not significantly higher in the people with lupus. And I think that really speaks to how you all and others have lived with lupus and being cautious and being protective, long before the pandemic, and was in a much better position to handle at least this part of it than perhaps the general population. And that's kind of borne out in these studies. So people with autoimmune conditions have very similar, and if they have a higher rate, it's very slightly higher in terms of the initial infection with COVID-19 compared to the general population. And that's led to the American College of Rheumatology's guidance as, they encouraged us to, as providers, to really share in the decision-making with our patients to continue to reduce the risk of being exposed to COVID-19 because of the slight increased risk, that we want to have fewer encounters with the healthcare system, at least in the beginning, and We were trying to do that the best that we can with the use of telehealth, reducing lab monitoring, things like that. But obviously things have evolved and will change over time, and people are certainly more active now. And rightfully so, with more immunizations and relatively less cases in the community, at least for now. So another question would be, what were the outcomes? Okay, so if people are not getting COVID, in huge numbers more than the general population with an immunocompromised condition, for those that did get COVID, did they have worse outcomes? And this is a study from the United Kingdom or England, looking at their electronic healthcare system database of over 17 million individuals, looking particularly at deaths in hospitals. And they confirmed what has been known, that age, obesity, and other comorbidities. You see here things like everything to the right of this line, if the bar is completely outside of that line. So this one doesn't count because it crosses that line. But you see here under cancer, and you see here with diabetes, it's significantly to the right. So that's a statistically significant increased risk of hospitalization deaths in people with diabetes and cancer, increased age, racial minorities, chronic liver disease. But you also see here certain autoimmune conditions, and they had to lump them together, but it didn't include people with lupus. And you certainly see it to the right of the line, although it's not way over to the right, which is good. And the bar is relatively kind of small, but it does point to the fact that there is an increased risk of worse outcomes. Here, it's death in the hospital if you do have certain autoimmune conditions and you get COVID. Here's another study here. It's a multi-site study of autoimmune conditions, about 2,400 individuals, and they compared them to over 140,000 matched controls, or people that didn't have autoimmune conditions. And they came to the conclusion that those with autoimmune conditions had slightly higher risk of hospitalization and being admitted into the intensive care unit. But at least in this study, they did not see a significant difference in deaths between the two groups. And these higher risks of hospitalization and being in the intensive care unit in those with autoimmune diseases actually went away when you controlled for comorbidities. And what that means is basically that the difference here of autoimmune patients being hospitalized more and being in the ICU more is because of their other conditions that often come with having that autoimmune condition. So we know very well that those of us who know people with lupus or have lupus ourselves, that not only do you have lupus, but oftentimes because of the treatments and the other issues, you have chronic lung conditions, chronic kidney conditions, perhaps because of some of the treatments, especially long-term use of prednisone and other things. Obesity becomes an issue. And those are well-known risk factors in the general population for poor outcomes. And those are the things that are driving the increased risk of poor outcomes in those with autoimmune disease, because people with autoimmune disease have all those other conditions more often than the people in the general population. Certainly, I think there is contribution from lupus and the autoimmune condition itself, but a lot of it is the comorbidities, the things associated with it. So I think it underscores what we all should be reminded of, is that I know just dealing with lupus is challenging enough. The last thing you want to do is go to your primary care doctor or kidney doctor and kind of deal with high blood pressure when you don't really even feel it. It just adds more medications to what you're already taking. You don't want to deal with something else, and that's all very understandable, but each additional medical issue that is left uncontrolled can not only lead to worse outcomes because of that issue, but in the context of COVID, it certainly greatly increases your risk of poor outcomes. And I'll just go a little faster here. This is a Danish study that looked into their national health registry and basically found that there was an increased risk of hospitalization in people with rheumatologic conditions, especially those with rheumatoid arthritis and vasculitis. They didn't see any increased risk in people with ankylosing spondylitis. This is a Swedish study in their national database. And the bottom line here is that there is an increased risk of hospitalization and intensive care units, admissions, and death. But when you control for this here, last thing here, this is not statistically significant. And that's because you control for all these other comorbidities that I just discussed. It doesn't, the risk of death, it doesn't become significant. So in other words, these other issues that often come with having autoimmune disease, cancer, heart disease, lung issues, kidney issues, strokes, those are the risks that are really driving the poor outcomes in people with lupus and other autoimmune conditions. So the risk of severe outcomes in those with rheumatologic conditions is very closely tied to age and other comorbidities, just like the general population. But the risk of hospitalization is still higher in those with rheumatologic conditions because there's so much more comorbidities in the lupus and other rheumatologic populations that we continue to need to be very careful. So the guidelines from the American College of Rheumatology and the European Rheumatology Organization called EULAR is that patients with autoimmune disease should be prioritized for things that would protect everybody, especially vaccination, post-exposure prophylaxis. I mean, this is things like the monoclonal antibodies, things that once you get exposed, you can take very early on and kind of reduce the severity of it. And other therapies to mitigate disease, meaning there are you might have heard that there's new drugs, pills, kind of like Tamiflu, what was out there for flu, that you can take early on in an infection that would make the infection much less severe. And that is just on the horizon for COVID. So whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, we have the ability in the near future to have access to safe medications that will make the infection much less severe in the vast majority of people, to add to everything else that we're doing in terms of the vaccinations and the safety protocols that we have. So our COVID-19 outcomes, more severe in people on certain medications. And that's another question to ask, right? So not just having lupus or other autoimmune conditions, but if you are taking, medication X because of your condition, is that medication causing an issue in terms of how severe a COVID infection may be in you? And a lot of information has come out of this international registry of both physicians who take care of people with rheumatologic conditions, as well as patients throughout the world that have gone and kind of reported their symptoms and issues online. And you can see it's a lot of European and North American sites, and a lot in South America, which is great. Relatively few in Africa, which is unfortunate, but at least there's activity, more engagement on that continent in terms of rheumatology, which is always, it's just very heartening to see that globalization, especially recruiting people and patients from the African continent, and then some places in Asia. So here, this is relatively early on. They looked in this registry at the question of what are the risk factors for hospitalization. And at that time, they had about 600 cases of people with various inflammatory rheumatologic conditions. And this is not all lupus. You can see the majority is 38% is rheumatoid arthritis, 14% is lupus, and then you can see the smattering of other rheumatologic conditions, what comorbidities they had, and other kind of characteristics. But these are people sick enough to receive COVID-19 diagnosis or testing, and what they found out was that the factors associated with hospitalization, again, are kind of going along with what's been seen in those other studies before: older age, having comorbidities. But being on prednisone greater than or equal to 10 milligrams a day was associated with increased hospitalization. Interesting, there were fewer hospitalization among those on certain medications like the anti-TNF medicines and rheumatoid arthritis, like Enbrel and Humira. So that was kind of a clue early on that there may be some differences in some of these medications. Just as a quick aside, this is kind of going back to some of the health disparities issues, and this registry was one of the earlier ones to really bring out the fact that there were more severe outcomes in communities of color. But going back in terms of the medications, they were looking at this point, not just hospitalizations, but they moved on and trying to look at mortality or death in that registry. So this is over 3,700 individuals in that registry at this point. This is further along in 2021 now. And again, you can see older age, things to the right here of one are at higher risk if they're completely free and clear of this line. So older age, perhaps male sex, smoking to a certain extent. But you can see here that having moderate to high disease activity was associated with death. And if you have very severe disease, what medicine are you more likely to get? You're probably going to get higher doses of prednisone and other steroids. So, if just because you're on higher doses of prednisone or 10 milligrams or more, doesn't mean that you should be overly concerned at this point. But perhaps, if you need that to get things under control, at least for the time being, that's what's most important, because it's that underlying disease activity that's going to be driving the risk for people to have poor outcomes if they were to get infected with COVID and unfortunately be hospitalized. So, being on immunosuppressive medications, a variety of different ones, again, being on the right side of this line here completely is higher risk of death, and being on medications that suppress your immune system. I mean, it's a very broad group of medicines here. But interestingly, sulfasalazine, which is not used that often in lupus, but it can be used more often in rheumatoid arthritis, is associated with worse outcomes. And that's been seen in at least a couple different studies, and we don't quite understand that. It's not a very strong immunosuppressive medication, whether it's the medicine itself or there's something about people who take sulfasalazine that makes them at increased risk. We're not sure. Some of you may have been on rituximab or Rituxan or on it or plan to be on it, and your doctor, your healthcare team is really talking to you about vaccination at your next opportunity. And that's because it comes out of studies like this, in that rituximab in particular, the ones that rituximab's in a family of medications that really sort of calm down the B cells, and the B cells are important in your immune response to vaccines as well as infections. And so it really has come out that, being on rituximab, if you're not vaccinated, they put you at a much higher risk of poor outcomes if you were to get COVID and become hospitalized. And I talked about the higher doses of glucocorticoids or prednisone. This is just to further underscore rituximab in another study was put people at much higher risk of having severe outcomes with COVID-19. And this is in rheumatoid arthritis. In rheumatoid arthritis, they use medications that are in a category called JAK inhibitors, and that's also been seen to be much higher risk. These this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about not so much focusing completely on medications, because the medications itself may be an indication of how severe your disease is. And here, if you are have moderate to high severe disease, so you're pretty active, and no matter what dose of prednisone you're on, you're going to be at much higher risk of poor outcomes with COVID. And so again, the steroid dose probably that you're seeing in these studies is a reflection of the underlying disease activity rather than the steroids or the prednisone itself. So all this to say is you need to really take care of your underlying condition the best that you can, first and foremost, and that'll be a great foundation from which to do well in terms of any potential infection, whether it be COVID or other things. Here's a study that was presented as an abstract, which is sort of a reviewed. It's not as high of a bar and as published manuscripts or publications that are in things like New England Journal of Medicine, and you may have heard of journals like that. And those go through a lot of peer review. Abstracts are smaller bits of information. They do undergo peer review, but not as much as those other journals. But still, I mean, it's better than people just kind of reporting something on their own without anybody else looking at it. So at our annual meeting in rheumatology, we have a lot of abstracts that are smaller bits of studies that were reviewed, and there are a lot of what we call posters that are presented in virtually. We had virtual posters, and then the really big ones out of these posters are selected for oral presentations, and people get a chance to present it to a much larger audience and have questions and answers and so forth. But this is one of the abstracts that was presented just last week, actually, of breakthrough infections in people with rheumatologic conditions. There were 197 individuals that had infections despite partial or full vaccination. Most received one of either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. And among the 87 fully vaccinated, there were 22 that were hospitalized, and the vast majority weren't, but still there's a significant proportion that were. And the point is, almost half were taking anti-CD20 drugs are rituximab, basically, and 3 were taking mycophenolate or Cellcept. So keep in mind that breakthrough infections are not very common. The vast majority of people who do get breakthrough infections, it's not severe at all, including people with autoimmune conditions. But autoimmune condition puts you at a greater risk of having a breakthrough infection that may be more severe. And the people that had more severe breakthrough infections were those that were on rituximab, and a few more that were taking sort of the susceptible. And that goes along with how medications, especially like rituximab, reduce the immune response. That's very important in how we respond to vaccine as well as the virus. So the summary here is that COVID-19 outcomes for people taking immunosuppression for autoimmune diseases are largely driven by what we know in the general population, that is older age individuals and those with certain comorbidities like kidney, liver, heart issues, cancer, what I mentioned earlier. Those are the ones, whether you have lupus or not. If you have those other comorbidities in an older age, that puts you at a much, much higher risk than just having lupus itself. There is a consistent signal of worse outcomes with high dose, moderate to high doses of prednisone or other glucocorticoids, but it's probably more a reflection of the underlying disease, as well as some contribution of the steroids for sure. But it really does point out that I think you need to treat the underlying condition the best that you can. The worst outcomes are those that seem to be on rituximab. These are by and large people who are not vaccinated, because that's where all the studies are coming from. If you are on rituximab and you benefit from it greatly, I think that the vaccination will help you a lot. We just don't know how much. We don't have that data yet. But keep in mind what I said, that control of your lupus is most important. And if you don't have any other alternatives and rituximab is working well for you, you really should, at your next opportunity, get that vaccination when you're in between dosing. That vaccination will really take hold much better. And then there's a very interesting observation of these JAK inhibitors and sulfasalazine also being associated with worse outcomes. And those that have been on cyclophosphamide, mycophenolate or Cellcept, azathioprine, tacrolimus, these are more commonly used medications in lupus. Those have been associated with slightly worse outcomes as well. So even with full vaccination, those taking things like rituximab and some immunosuppressants are at risk for severe COVID-19, but the vaccinations do help. So going into questions, just sort of lump these together, and you can see here that there's a theme about booster shots. Do I need the booster? I've had my vaccine. Do I need a booster? I've got these other comorbidities, and what should I do? If I'm on Plaquenil, do I need a third dose of the COVID? And is there a chance that having other shots may change the efficacy of the booster shot? Other vaccines don't impact the efficacy of the boosters, and you should get the flu shot during this time anyway. And in fact, there's no reason why you can't take them both together. A lot of people don't, just because either psychologically or they don't want to run the chance of having any issues compounded by taking both together. And that's fine, but theoretically, there's really no downside of taking both together. And if that's your only opportunity, that's fine. But I do want to talk generally, and I can't answer these questions any more specifically or individually. But I will use this as an opportunity to talk about boosters. Booster shot is one of the messages that didn't go out really well early in the pandemic. And I understand that there was so much going on, but in the area of immunology and vaccination, I think almost everybody predicted that we would need a booster shot for COVID vaccines. And this is not just COVID response, COVID vaccination response, but this is really vaccinations in general, in that when you get your first dose or first round of vaccines, the way your immune system works, that first immune response is, it's a good one, and it lasts for a while, but inevitably it wanes. And so at some point you do need a booster. And when you do get a booster, because you have this memory of responding here, that boost, it truly is a boost. You get this really nice response. And so the response is much larger, it's much faster, and hopefully it will remain longer in terms of an immune response. So, almost everybody predicted that we needed booster shots. And so, and when I just talked about in terms of being immunosuppressed, being on certain medications, you're going to have more breakthroughs, you're going to have worse outcomes. Compared to the general population, you'll still be pretty well protected as a whole, but relative to the general population, because you're going to have those issues, you're going to need a booster. And earlier than others. And that's how things rolled out, right? The first people that were approved, quote unquote, for the booster shots were those with immunocompromised conditions, including lupus. And just underscore, why those with lupus should think about getting a booster shot is, again, this comes from Dr. Oliver's presentation to the CDC advisory committee for vaccines. She presented data that you can see. Go to this website if you want more details, but she points to the fact that those who are immunocompromised are more likely to get severely ill, as we discussed. Those people are at higher risk for having longer infection and shedding, which means the virus just remains in your body to be able to be spread longer to other people. And because it's in your body longer, there's more chance of reproduction and variants coming out of it, basically. And so we obviously don't want that. And therefore, you're more likely to transmit COVID to other people around you, especially in your household. And as I pointed out earlier, those with immunocompromised conditions are more likely to have a breakthrough infection. So remember, breakthrough infections happen in general, and they're probably happening all the time, and we're not even hearing about most of them, because in most people who got a vaccine in the general population, the breakthrough infection is like a mild cold. But if you are immunocompromised, and if you especially are, taking medications that lower your immune system, these breakthrough infections are potentially much more severe. And there's a 44% of those people with breakthrough infections that were hospitalized in the US were immunocompromised. And in Israel, about 40% of the people that were hospitalized for breakthrough infection were those that were immunocompromised. And so this shouldn't really show that, why even get vaccinated. But the fact that it could be a lot worse than this, and you need all the protection that you can get to prevent from getting to this. These numbers would be much, much higher if you had these people. I mean, the outcomes would be a lot worse had these people not have been vaccinated. So please keep that in mind. The whole thing about boosters, especially immunocompromised people, came originally out of the study that looked at organ transplant. I mean, when you get an organ donated to you, you don't want your body to reject it. So you're on medications to lower your immune system, kind of like what happens in lupus. You can kind of think about lupus as, you're rejecting certain parts of your own body without having it being transplanted. But in these organ transplant patients that are on very strong immunosuppressive medications, they had very much lower response to the vaccines compared to other groups. Even those on general immunosuppressive medications, but the organ transplants that are much higher doses had very poor response that got much better with the vaccines, with the boosters as well. So here we talk about a very common question that I've been hearing a lot. Basically, what happens in people with lupus that get the COVID vaccine? Are you at risk of getting a flare or any other side effects? So these are a bunch of abstracts that were presented at the recent meeting. So again, keep in mind that they're not full-blown journal articles, but they do represent some pretty good studies. I'm presenting a few of them here. There's a couple more that I just didn't have time to put in. So one is a study out of Spain, and these are the authors here. They looked at, from Catalonia, Spain, patients with immune-mediated rheumatic diseases. So these are not all people with lupus. Here, about 44% with rheumatoid arthritis, 7%. Oops. Something happened with my PowerPoint. Just give me 1 second. At least you guys are still online with me. Just to remind you that this is a study from Spain of different rheumatologic conditions. 7% were lupus, and they had information that was obtained through clinic visits, and follow-ups were made by telephone. Vaccination was confirmed through the medical records, and their conclusion was that those with immune-mediated rheumatologic disease, the safety of the vaccines was satisfactory. The flares were uncommon. They only saw about 5%, and these were mostly mild. The vaccine side effects were similar to those expected for the general population and reassuring for those with rheumatologic conditions. This is another abstract from Canada, Ines Comenia, who actually was at Emory for a while. I miss her dearly. She's an amazing, wonderful person, but she's in Quebec. She conducted, her group conducted a clinical trial, really. It's a non-randomized, open label clinical trial at 2 of the centers in Quebec, Canada. The participants were those with rheumatoid arthritis on stable treatment, lupus on stable treatment with Susceptible, and other rheumatologic conditions with people on 10 milligrams or more of prednisone. And they enrolled 220 participants, including 131 with rheumatoid arthritis, 23 with lupus. And this was the Moderna vaccine. That's the number here. And they found that the vaccine was not associated with severe disease flares. Like previous studies, MMF or Susceptible or mycophenolate and rituximab were associated with reduced immune response to the vaccine. So again, we know that our medications are going to reduce the effectiveness of the vaccines, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't get it. This is another study from Baltimore, Johns Hopkins, with Dr. Petrie. She looked at her lupus cohort and collected information from those that had a positive PCR test to confirm their COVID infection. And out of 860 people with lupus, and so this is a lupus-only cohort, 65 were tested positive by PCR for COVID. And their conclusion was basically COVID infection did not lead to an increase in lupus activity. And instead, there was actually a decrease in skin activity perhaps explained by being in quarantine and not being out in the sun or being exposed or stressed in some other way, perhaps. They did find that there was an increase in some of these anticardiolipin antibodies after the infection, but that did not increase antiphospholipid antibodies. But bottom line, they didn't see a very big increase in lupus activity. Here's the last abstract that I'll show you. This is out of New York City Hospital for Special Surgery. And they emailed a web survey to over 7,000 people with over the age of 18 who were evaluated at least once by rheumatologists in a certain center in New York, and they included individuals who received at least one dose of the vaccine, and they looked for people with lupus specifically. And they asked people to self-report whether they had a disease flare, and they defined that as a sudden worsening of your rheumatologic condition or arthritis within 2 weeks of the vaccine dose. So their data suggests that over 91% of people with lupus did not experience a disease flare after the vaccination. Of those that did, most had mild flares. Given almost all patients reported that their post-vaccine flare was quote unquote typical of their lupus flares, vaccine side effects alone may not explain these findings. So basically, again, this one, smaller numbers, reassuring that the vast majority do fine, smaller numbers do flare, but it seems to be relatively mild. If a person gets COVID and is treated with monoclonal antibodies once and gets reinfected with COVID, can they get them again? Yes. Okay, so sorry to go long, but it's been a while since I've been with you all. It's good to see you. Just to remind you of the resources that Terry and her group continue to procure and to update. Please continue to go to other trusted resources and help each other by interacting in forums like this. Keep sending your questions and comments to the email that you see below. We'll continue to meet when we can on the second Sundays to disseminate the information that we have available. And again, thank you for your time and attention. Stay safe.